My name is Seth Early. Welcome to our webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about agent-based approaches for LLM applications and really trying to talk about some of the details that you need to get into for building these things and how we need to kind of govern them, how we need to think about them, and give you some examples of an orchestration agent and then a task-based agent. My name is Seth Early. I'm founder and CEO of Early Information Science. I've been in the space for many, many years. Many of you know the book that I authored called The AI-Powered Enterprise. We didn't talk about agents there, but we also didn't talk about LLMs, but everything in that book is still valid today. Let me go ahead and let our other panelists introduce themselves. Sanjay, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Sanjay Mehta. I'm a principal solution architect with Early Information Science, and my background's been a couple decades in search and e-commerce and AI. Again, e-commerce and search have been kind of one of the first sort of intake, as we all probably know, for a lot of AI applications, and excited to share a lot of the sort of research and things we've been working on with the rest of you.
And we're here with our partners at Arcana and Reliable Genius. So Alexander, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Alexander Klein, a founding partner of Arcana Concept, which is one part R&D lab and another part studio. I've been part of many startups, also in e-commerce and other parallel technologies for some time now. And Arcana Concept is kind of the synthesis of all the things that I've learned and all the people that I've met along the way.
Wonderful. How about you, Dom? You want to give a quick thumbnail introduction?
Sure. Yeah. So I've worked for the last 7 years as a front-end team lead for Blockchain Intelligence Group, where we offer information services to law enforcement on cryptocurrency. Over the last year or so, I've been working on building up my own startup called Reliable Genius for offering AI services to solutions for businesses.
Wonderful. And we're going to hear a lot about those solutions in a little bit. I do want to cover our housekeeping. We're recording this, so if you have to drop or you want colleagues to listen to it or you want to listen to it later, you will have the recording and the slides. We're going to shoot for 50 minutes. We have a lot of content today, and we'll try to take some questions at the end, but you can also ask us during the session. And we have a couple of polls and then a quick feedback survey. And we also have an offering around doing a workshop for you guys. So if you want to stick around and take the poll, that'd be great. And we'll also share the URL for signing up for doing a workshop. There is a cost to that, but we can talk about how deep you want to go. We can certainly do briefings for executives and so on. And Early Information Science, as many of you know, has been around for 30 years doing this kind of work. And we have a big roster of clients. I won't go into all of that. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about agents and assistants and chatbots. And thinking of agents, I think of assistants and chatbots as analogous to one another. We're probably going to use that more interchangeably, but agents, thinking of agents as you can have stateful and stateless agents, chatbots, and assistants, but we're going to talk about agents being more stateful, chatbots, assistants more stateless. But we'll try not to get too arcane or into the weeds. But the point is, we'll talk about some differences between them. Thinking about process automation with LLMs, because there's been a lot of excitement and a lot of hype and a lot of unrealistic expectations around LLMs and generative AI. We believe the best way to use that is in the context of retrieving organizational data. But in retrieving organizational data, we have to use APIs and we have to basically use agent-based approaches. And then we can do lots of other things with agents. And we'll talk about a task agent approach for iteratively processing data in order to improve that data. That's one of our examples. Then Dom is going to talk about LLM agent engineering, and we'll give you an example of an orchestration agent that's called Fizban, which has a bit of a personality to it as a conductor of agent, an agent of agents. And then we'll talk about contextualization, data retrieval, the system, the process, the function, organizational context, user preferences. And we'll get into some guidelines, traceability, privacy, governance, respecting communication and role context, and then getting started is really our URL, which I probably should have put up front here for you guys, but you'll see it in the slide deck. Now, here I want to start with a quick poll to get people started. Where are you in your agentic AI journey? Is it not on the radar? Are you planning this? Are you doing experiments? Again, this is agent approaches, and maybe you don't know enough about what this means, so you can say none of the above. But Carolyn, do you want to go ahead and put that poll up so that we can have people make those selections? I assume you have your poll. There you are. So again, is it not on the radar? Are you planning this? Are you doing some experiments? Are you deploying them? Oh, it looks like we got some people deploying them. That's great. Let's see. We'll just give this a few minutes while the popcorn is popping. At least no one is banning them, because this is derivative of our other AI survey where we say, hey, are you allowed to use AI? So it looks like no one is banning them. A few people not on the radar. That's significant. I know there's your planning. So a good portion of folks are planning. None of the above. You can give us an answer in a Q&A or the chat section. Give us some feedback on that. I assume we have chat at least open for participants. So if you can put that in there, or you can put it in your Q&A if it's none of the above. Just curious what that means. So we see people have implemented. We see they've deployed them. That's fantastic. But we still see a lot of the majority of folks that are in the planning stages. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. I think the popcorn has stopped popping. We got a couple of people. Now we're sharing that, so you can see there's a lot of folks that are planning these things. So there's a lot of implications to the planning. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and move on to the next screen. So again, when we think about agents, they're really autonomously solving problems, broader challenges. They can take actions that either have human intervention or don't have intervention. And when we talk about assistance, they're really handling a narrow set of tasks. You could say you have an agent-based assistant, but again, we're just talking about these being something that are requiring more human approval and intervention, less autonomy. And then chatbots, again, are simpler tasks, usually information retrieval, usually stateless information retrieval. So when we think about agents, it's stuff that they're tools that are going out and acting on behalf of the user and acting in order to accomplish a task much more broadly. And it can have limited human intervention. It can be without human intervention. We'll talk about examples of both, or they can be collaborative. So there's a lot of possibilities around what agents are. But anytime we're kind of going outside of the pure LLM context, we're building agentic approaches. And when we think about automation, and this is the same thing that happens with automation, no matter whatever the context is, whether it's customer service, whether it's personal assistance, types of functions or data analysis, we really need to understand that process. I always like to say you can't automate what you don't understand, right? You can't automate a mess, although I guess you can automate a mess, and then you have an automated mess. But this is one of my old sayings. If you don't understand the process, it's very hard to determine where those interventions will make the most sense. Do you have the right data sources available? Again, a lot of times we're doing retrieval augmented generation. So we're using the LLM to interpret things and make things conversational and to understand intent and to do natural language processing. That's all great, but we don't want to rely entirely on the LLM for answers. We want to go to either past conversations with humans. We want to go to other data sources. We want to go to other APIs, other tools, other specialized agents, right? So there can be an agent that's tuned with a particular subject matter expertise, say in metallurgy, which is the one that one of the levels of expertise or areas of expertise of the FizzBan agent we're going to talk about, or some other domain expertise, or some finely tuned knowledge resource, right? So you can have agents that are going to go off and do other things. LLMs are notoriously bad at math, but you can go to an API and you can perform, mathematical functions and get the answer back, right? And of course, sufficient data quality if it's structured correctly for retrieval. So you still need to think about retrieval. You still need to think about knowledge and knowledge architecture and those types of things. Sanjay, do you want to talk a little bit about this particular slide, or do you want to share your other slide? Do you want me to let you share for a moment?
Yeah, I'll share.
Okay, so I'll
talk about what are the elements what are the core sort of aspects of assembling an agent? And then, as you know, agents are building off of a lot of what is offered in a lot of the LLM platforms. OpenAI is very notorious. Anthropic as well as another well-known one. A lot of folks are using. So thinking about putting these together, again, it's a task you wanted to perform. You may again, does domain be a big one? Think about the capability you want to deliver and how focused it needs to be, and giving it some definition there. And then thinking about how you're going to deploy this, and of course, cost is a factor. Running it internally versus externally. There's internal models that you can run if you're in a highly secure, protected environment versus having things in a more of a public fashion, right? Using a public model, for example, and sometimes a combination of the two. And there may be actual other aspects where you're using different types of AIs, not just LLM, for example, in the mix. So just to consider sort of that whole like architecture and platform, and then a configuration piece where how are we're interfacing, for example, how is this going to be used? What type of form factor or UX are we offering? To consider that, right? A chatbot, of course, is a traditional voice assistant. I know many folks have probably been familiar with at home. And now there's a lot of other different forms where you might deploy this in other fashion, even in your existing search or UX navigation, right? Guided navigation or conversational flows. So just things to think about when you're assembling a solution like this. And then finally, of course, the governance, that's critical, right? Security, ethics, the guardrails and the measurement of this is the evaluation, right? Making sure it's hitting your goals. Okay.
And by the way, I just had a note here that said you can always automate what you don't understand. Indeed, I'd argue most organizations do. I think that's meant tongue in cheek. I think that's funny, but when you start thinking about the intervention, right? Where do you want to be able to have that intervention? Yes, they don't understand it at some level, but at some level, somebody has to get in the weeds and understand that. And then we had another comment, none of the above, advising clients, not doing anything myself. That's fine. So let us know if we can help you advise your clients. Maybe we can partner together. Anyway, let's keep going. Go ahead, Sanjay. You were going to add more to talk about this. And this is one of the configuration environments for one of the agent approaches that we use. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where we bring in essentially the fundamental information architecture, knowledge engineering and such, right? Getting like metadata across all your content sources or building metadata and making it available in a way that the models like an agent and LLM can understand, right? And I think some of you might be familiar with retrieval augmented generation and embeddings and vectors and a lot of those sorts of things. And so that's, I think, a big important fundamental piece is that's one part of it, but you might be having your customer or user data or your security also in a form that you want to make available to build context for the engine. And you may have additional functions or tools you want to configure and set up, like certain actionable types of outcomes you want to occur or want the AI to perform on behalf of your users. One path to do that is creating what we call templates, and it could be in your prompts, it could be in your memory, it could be in your responses. There's many ways to, even in your training, these sorts of systems. But here's an example where you have, a template for your system definition, which is your configuration. And again, where you're kind of defining what the narrow role, focus, and domain would be. You would, choose your model as well. Here you can choose different types of settings. Like, for example, if you want to seed the user prompt, which is kind of compelling, right? If you want to make it more personalized, where we take in like that customer or user information and seed the context, that would be an example. And then we have the data itself. So where does the data come from, right? Is it a knowledge graph store, which I think many folks might be using here, or is it existing vector? Or rebuilding a vector? Again, where is this sort of information coming from to support the LLM and the agent, right, in its input and output? And then, of course, tools are a big one. In this case, we're talking a little bit about an example where whether it's like a dealer scenario, automotive, like lending and sales, where you might have something like a local inventory lookup tool, right? Looking up at dealer inventory. It could be a store lookup if it's product. It could be information lookup and content lookup. So that would be kind of the example of parameters that get passed through and where they come from your organization and your architecture. So that, is got, for example, here in a scenario, it was an output of one of the sort of agents. We're using, like an open source platform to build agents. And so here we've got lending agent, and a dealer sales agent, and also just an agent for you to search, basically retrieve information off your own local storage. For example, in the case of a lending agent, we've configured it in a way, right, to narrow some of the focus, retrieve some files, for example, that are local to the organization, like the dealership, and maybe, for example, how they do lending, and of course, seeding, continuing conversations for the user. So that's sort of a reverse prompting. This is a good example of a type of agent you may have, and spinning up any of these is quite easy, right, to do in these types of systems where you just add these definitions and templates, and then have something purpose built for that end user. And then here would be an example of more of a sales agent, right? And this sort of conversation, and where you're seeing some of the sources it's retrieving when trying to perform a sales engagement for a user in advance, right? When they're really early on their research, for example, of car buying, versus when they're looking at actually making the purchase with the loan. So just to give you kind of an example of two scenarios where it's bringing some of that configuration we just showed in. So that's what I had on my end.
Okay, let me go back and I will share my screen again and pick it up where you had left off. Okay, can you guys see my presentation now? So one of the things that I have used in the past is talking about domain and task complexity. I changed that up a little bit here to talk about the action complexity. I used to talk about task and domain complexity. And the idea is you have different levels of complexity of the action, and you have different levels of complexity of the domain. And it could be something that's in a simple area, or it can be something in a more complex area, such as, order information retrieval versus life sciences analysis or financial analysis. So you can kind of get into these different areas of complexity. I used to say, don't start in the upper right-hand corner, but you can, in certain situations, start in the upper right-hand corner. And you can have these different types of agents that will assist you, but you just need to think about what that action will be, what that process will be, where that information is coming from, and the level of complexity of the activities and the actions. So you do have to think about this in terms of multiple dimensions. And it's very important to think about what that ultimate workflow will look like in order for us to build the right agent. And again, you're looking for efficiencies, right? So where can you have an intervention that's going to reduce the manual work? And what's happening is you're having the ability to, and this is some research that I came across, language models to teach themselves to use different APIs and different tools, which is very interesting. So this is kind of overcoming a lot of the intrinsic limitations around hallucinations and non-language tasks, right? Because again, you're mitigating hallucinations by saying, if you don't have the answer from this data source, say, I don't know, but you're giving it a data source, and you're giving it a curated data source, a high quality data source. But this article also talks about the language models learning how to call APIs and understanding when they don't have the capability, which is really fascinating. I mean, the stuff that's happening with emerging capabilities is really amazing, but I would recommend this. I'm going to turn it over to Alex now to talk about this, first of all, Arcana, and then talk about the orchestration agent that he built. So I'll just move your slides forward, unless you want me to turn the control to you. It's up to you, Alexander.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, I think it was important to talk a little bit, just briefly, about Arcana concept, just because it kind of sets the table for, why we were thinking in a way where we needed this sort of conductor agent, and how that came about. Arcana concepts.
By the way, they're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, they exist somewhere in cyberspace like that. So I think we're actually over 50 people now, but it's we're sort of a remote think tank. You could think of us that way as well. And so we're kind of existing in Slack all together. And it's all these different people with different backgrounds and skill sets and different geographic locations. And so time zones are a thing. People missing messages are a thing. There's tons of channels inside of it. We like to encourage them to spin up. They have an idea, spin that up in a channel and run with it, and invite people in that might be interested in progressing it. So what we're trying to do there is really invent things, really get to a point where, instead of it taking 6 months to be able to present your idea, you can get there in a couple of weeks, because you're bouncing it off the right people. You're building prototypes, you're visualizing what it is that you're trying to do, you're coming up with the angles, you're doing all the research really quickly from inside the group and getting it to a presentable point where it could go and be funded or be given to users. So not all of it's software, some of it's hardware-based, agri-tech solutions, energy solutions. And what we want to be able to do is provide people with augmented resources and to grow. So in doing so, we realized this is going to be really hard to do without a tool of some kind. And of course, LLMs were coming out. We've been playing with them for, I guess, almost a year now, right, Dom?
Yeah.
And we decided, like, hey, let's bring these ChatGPT based ones into the group. Let's pull them through the Slack API and see what they can do to accelerate ideation, research, communication, coordination, of being able to present the ideas and also preserve them. So that's the key, I think, to all of AI is it's a creativity accelerator, and being able to get to an MVP sooner before, you've missed your timing or you don't have that fire to bring your idea to the world anymore because you're seeing other people perhaps encroaching on it in certain ways. And so I started to architect kind of just for fun, and it was fun, and it felt like I was playing with a toy at the beginning, this sort of wizard character. I kept thinking of like all the wizards that you've seen, the archetype of the kind of the goofy, wise wizard, the Merlins, and the absent-minded professor kind of aspect that they have. But what if we made that guy an expert on material science? What if we made him read Eric Ries's book on lean startup, but also speak in a wizardly parlance, keep track of everything that's going on in the Slack group to the best of its ability, move conversations forward, coordinate with other agents like a virtual owl to go search the web. So I had all these ideas about how cool this would be if it worked. And of course, that's where immediately you run into issues if you've not got the correct information architecture for your organization. The wizard, once we started using him, Fizzban, as we named him, he would start reminding us that, hey, I'm a stateless chatbot. Like I don't really remember these things or commit them to any kind of long-term memory. So you're starting all over again with me. And that's where we started to look at the more complex memory architectures, what RAM could bring to the table. And that's really where Dom came in with LLM engineering. But yeah, we can go to the next slide. So when Dom stepped into the picture and stepped up and started helping actually connect my really basic wizard recipe into something more functional, we did arrive at a place where we have this character omnipresent in our Slack group that can remember people's names, can remember what their backgrounds are, what they're good at, can keep track of projects, is capable of doing search now all from inside of Slack. So you're never having to like jump screens or lose your train of thought. And I think he's, especially in the last 2 or 3 months, he's really been very, very useful to the point of Dominique taking the architecture and saying, hey, what if we could apply this to other co-located teams and other remote teams? And you wouldn't have to have the same wizard personality. You could create your own recipe of like the type of personality that fits your business and your brand and your workflows, and snap that together and bring them into your work environment. So that's kind of where we're headed with them. And I think we have a few slides coming up that show some of the things he can do. So yeah, here's some of the basics that he can do. Handing off tasks to other specialized agents, tracking multiple threads and conversations, managing short, long-term memory while respecting privacy and privileged conversations. There's many reasons why that is a really big deal and something to get right. I think we can just show, if we go to the next slide, we can just show some of the examples. Okay, so I'll just describe what's going on here. This is from screenshots from inside our internal Slack at Arcana Concept. On the left-hand side in dark mode there, you can see I wanted Fizzban to learn that it was Dominique's birthday on that date, and I had him compose just a little ditty, a little birthday song for him in the general chat. So this is how you can also contribute to your culture and to making people feel included and to kind of keep people engaged. So I thought that was a really good example. And then kind of on the other side of that, on the light background, this is him doing some hardcore engineering assistance, and he's helping us. So we were riffing on an idea. There's some electrical engineers, mechanical engineers in our group. along with e-commerce people, hey, what if we did a robotic teddy bear for kids, right? And what would that look like? You know, sort of like that singing fish on the wall that I don't think anybody's changed or innovated on in like 30 or 40 years. So we started riffing on that, and we had to ask them. We're testing them out, like, so we're asking them, what would the approximate, knowing what you know about the teddy bear we've described, what would be the approximate battery size we would need? What, you know, what are the components that would be required here to make this teddy bear work for 15 hours? So you can see it comes up with the answer. So I asked some of my friends too, I'm like, hey, you work for an engineering firm, are you guys using any tooling like this? And they're like, sadly, no, not yet. But you can see how this could totally help accelerate things. Here's one of my favorite things that FizzBan is getting better at and can do really, really well. And you can see he's got an understanding of who the people are that would be helpful to that specific project, and he's pulling them from his memory. You can see he's included somebody that would be really great at contributing on a creative level, as well as somebody really great from an engineering level, e-commerce level. He sort of tied it all together, marketing level, a startup level, so that he could bring funding. So I love this tool that we've developed, and I think it bodes really well for the future as the models get better. We go to like GPT-5 or something with even better reasoning. Well, they're just going to get better and better at understanding more complex tasks and connecting them within the context of an organization to potentially other agents, right? Like Seth was saying, if it's bad at math, go to the Wolfram Alpha agent and get the math calculation done by that, right? And then come back to me and ask me a question on, is this the answer that you were looking for? What's the next step? So always come back to sort of a human for decision making, but let it run autonomously enough with enough of an audit trail and transparent sort of record that you can trace back like where it might have gone wrong. So there's this loop of self-correction happening and training happening all the time. I think that's it. I don't know if we have another one specific to this, but Seth, if you want to step forward.
So I will. One of the things, we have a couple of questions. So one of them is each thread of FizzBan, is each thread of FizzBan a separate JSON file or something similar? How does interact with structured data?
Perfect intro to Dominique and take us into the weeds.
So with FizzBan, I designed a custom memory system. So it has like a dynamic memory system where it has basically CRUD operations on being able to create, update, and delete memories within its context. And so it builds up a memory when it's chatting with users based on and it has access to its previous conversations within the current thread. So that's how we kind of manage the memory within the system. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. There's another one. I have a computer control in a factory that monitors several signals. I worked out sets of rules and discriminants to parse the data to identify one or more of a dozen different types of conditions that could have occurred. If I want to have the control upload the collected data along with representative samples of key attributes of the different conditions, have the AI identify which conditions the data is a match with, and transmit the answer back into the control, what tools should I get set up with? I think that may be an offline discussion because it does sound very specific. If we can come back to that, keep that in mind while we go to the next section. And Robert, we may be able to get that answer to you. But let me go ahead and turn this over to Dominique, and we'll just watch our time. But go ahead and explain your thinking here in terms of context and some of the other.
So
for that explanation of FizzBan.
Yeah, when some of the things that we came across when designing FizzBan is that like context relevance is really important, and having the correct context at the right time of inference is really important. And so if you have like too small of a context size, then you get insufficient context. And if you're like have too large of a context with not enough relevant information in there, then they can hallucinate and go off track and not provide relevant information. So there's a balance there. You got to try and find the ideal balance of providing just the right amount of context with enough information to be able to answer the question. But and the more information that you can provide, the better. But then if you do too much information, you also like start incurring more and more cost associated with having larger and larger context size. But the cost of LLM size is the costs are starting to go down, so it's becoming more and more efficient to add larger context to it. It's just mainly you want to have a high accuracy of the content that you're providing in there, so it's highly relevant information to be answering the specific question that the user is asking. Next slide, please. So another thing that we come across often is like the workflow design. And if your problem and choosing the right workflow design for the problem that you're coming across, sometimes you're able to just do it in a single shot, just with querying the LLM once to be able to get the right answer that you need. But oftentimes, like if you're trying to design a system that is becoming more and more complex, it's often better to go to a multi-agentic workflow to split the problem into multiple different chunks that different agents could be better suited to. So you could design an example that I did recently was like a LinkedIn post generator, where I had an agent that was a storyteller agent, and then another one that was a research agent that would go to the web and go search for information, and then an editor agent that would edit all of the information to design a nice LinkedIn post. And so that's an example of a multi-agentic workflow. Whereas a single shot is just, typing in something into a ChatGPT. Next slide, please. So when you're designing your agent perspective, you want to think about what kind of perspective that you're designing the agent from, and whether they're like either a personal assistant or an autonomous agent, because they each have characteristics and use cases and challenges that are better suited to them, to the different workflows. Where like a personal assistants are more talking from the perspective of the operator who's operating it, whereas autonomous agents are more talking from the perspective of being autonomous outside of the agent who's querying it. So it's there's can be different use cases and challenges that come across with those. Mainly autonomous agents are really good at process automation and exploration and research, whereas personal assistants are better at like executive support and customer service. Next slide, please.
I was just going to ask a question. What is the relationship between and with memory and privacy, right? We talked about how respect, your agent would need to respect that, but you also need to have memory. So how is that a fair question to answer?
Yeah, so
it ties into this as well, but keep going.
Yeah, with memory and privacy, the way that you want to kind of structure it is you want to be able to filter out any of the information if it's private information that shouldn't be shown to the agent. And so ideally you want to be able to have a system in place that can automatically filter the context or the context window information, so that only the information that should be shown to the agent is accessible to the agent. And at that time of them being able to access it. So essentially, don't delegate the task of privacy to the agent itself, because the agent will have that information in their memory, and it could be accessed through that. So you're better off to just try and filter it out before it gets to the agent. Securing AI agents, public versus private. So if you're designing an agent and you're trying to make them like public, I mean accessible outside of the organization, whereas internally accessible inside of the organization, there's two inherent levels of trust there. And so if you're designing a publicly accessible agent, you want to like have very strict security rules around it so that you're not injecting any privately internal data within the agent. So you only expose data that you want to be discoverable through the public domain. And same with like internally accessible agents. You're more in a trusted environment, but you can restrict access and have deeper contextual integration with that internal data because they're more of an internal trusted audience. Optimizing LLM agent workflows and triggering mechanisms and action execution. So there's many different ways of being able to trigger an LLM workflow as well as executing actions based on and some of them here that I list here are just manual triggers, automated triggers, scheduled triggers, conditional triggers. So like based on some action within your organization, you can do text generation, data processing, and decision support, task automation, so and workflow orchestration. So here's are just some of the ways that you can use to be able to input and output to LLM workflows. Next
Yeah, there
slide.
has to be mechanism to say, how are you going to kick this off? And then what happens during that process?
Right. Yeah.
Processes.
So enhancing trust and efficiency in LLM workflows, the role of transparency and debugging in AI-driven processes. It's really important to be able to be transparent with your process and try to increase trust as much as you can. So you build trust by ensuring accountability. If you provide like references to where the content came from that the LLM is using to generate its responses, that provides credibility and it explains the reasoning behind it, and you're able to visualize the workflows and then debugging workflows. I use a tool called Lengsmith that helps to be able to visualize all the different workflows that are within that the agent is being triggered, and I can go through and see all the actions that it's doing, and it just helps me to just drill down to where the agent is and what it's doing, because it's very difficult to visualize how it's working through just a debug log. And then you analyze behavior and implement feedback. So you can start to, once you get lots of flows going, you can say, is that a good flow or is that a bad flow? And you can use that, start collecting data around that to be able to start training your LLM to be able to respond better.
Yep. That's great. And again, I think this is true of a lot of different things where we're trying to have continuous improvement and really that double loop learning. Someone did have a question about learning. Learning can happen in terms of improving the knowledge source, but it can also be around improving the process. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. What I do want to just reinforce again is generation versus retrieval. I think most everybody is at least familiar with the idea that, we can ask the LLM the question, but that's prone to hallucination. We still process the result to make it more conversational, or we retrieve from some type of corporate knowledge base. And that's what we're really talking about when we get into agentic workflows. And the LLMs are used to understand the query and also to present the results. But we have different levels of sophistication when it comes to retrieval augmented generation. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but we use a modular RAG approach in order to do things like improve data curation and data quality. And do you want to just talk through this build here, Sanjay? I know usually I talk it through, but why don't you go ahead and provide your explanation? So we start off with the data sources to be enriched, and then you basically ingest other artifacts. Do you want to kind of walk through the pieces of this?
Yeah, this is a good example of another sort of agent type of configuration where its goal is given to improve, for example, product data or content, right? And giving that specific task definition, and then providing it with the data. If we look at the kind of the data configuration, where to get the data, or what tools does it need to like conduct a search, for example, to retrieve the data from the organization, which is a big common use case we run into, right? Like it may need to crawl some sites, it may need to parse some PDFs or read some PowerPoints, those sorts of things. So that's like another task or tool that the agent would conduct for each one of these. And if you think about rules and governance, right, you might have a style guide or a branding guidelines that it needs to honor. So that's part of like sort of constraining it and giving it the guardrails. A lot of it too is, maybe you don't have everything internally, but you do want to allow some degree of sourcing data from its own internal knowledge or point it to other sources outside of what you may have. For example, a lot of folks try to use what the Google programmable search or their own knowledge graph APIs to enhance data. So that's like again a powerful capability that's there. Let's not forget about making each response very user specific and user contextual, and how that also can be used to train and tune what the agent is doing, particularly, right, the signals and the interactions and responses we're getting from the users who are using the system. And in the case of enrichment like this, it may actually be where the outcome is improving search relevance, for example, or product conversions, the response from a search perspective, improving sort of the task, the ticketing time, for example. And then again, there's looking at an overall picture, just the whole from an agent perspective, having a repository, whether it's building a knowledge graph that it needs to work with. If you think about a whole catalog or corpus of content, building that graph so it has the entire context that it's dealing with, whether it's an organization or all that, is key. And that's a great output too, for example, for the organization to use if they don't have it. And I think what the big piece here is really around thinking at scale. When we do things at scale, with memory, for example, and trying to minimize your costs and tokens, this agent approach is pretty fantastic because you can give it some standing tasks, some standing tools that are more stateful. And then the stateless requests, for example, might be each product, even when you're talking about millions of products in multiple fields, being able to just pass that sort of specific need while it has that memory and state to operate on, rather than pushing it every time into a context window, which can get enormously expensive. So that's like an overview of using that type of approach.
And this is just an example of, for this particular organization, we started off with very sparse data, and we used this in a templated, approach where we used an agent to go off and do the things that we were just talking about to come back. So the prompt was really the sparse data, and then the response after we went through all of those sub processes were the new names, the new attributes that was drawn from external sources and internal sources. And a lot of people try to do this, and we've seen this fail a lot, but we've been able to do this successfully. And so you see something that started with very, very sparse data, to have a more descriptive product name, a new description that's SEO friendly, keywords, new categories, new attributes, and then the reasoning behind that. So this is a very practical example of an agent-based approach that is used to iteratively enrich product data. And since product data, and it can be used for knowledge as well, right? We can have the same types of prompts with sparse data and then return back enriched metadata using a content model. We can derive knowledge graphs. There's a lot of stuff that we can do. Then that becomes the foundation for other types of applications. So let's just talk a little bit about the guidelines and guardrails. And someone had asked a question about learning. And how do we define the reasoning ability, and how do we we talked a little bit about this. So this is kind of a summary. How do we control this? How is it managed? Do you want to talk a little bit about this, Alexander and Dominique?
Yeah, I guess Yeah, all great features come with wouldn't it be cool if? And I think a lot of that is people hoping these things can do more than they can do at the moment, but also with every generation we get better and better reasoning abilities. So I think of that as just the ability of the AI to sort of think more and more like a human being, and be less and less sort of on guardrails, and less micromanaged. Dom, I don't know. Do you think of it kind of differently than that?
Yeah, well, it depends on the environment that you're in, really, for the specific use case. In our trusted Slack environment, it's fairly liberal and it doesn't really have very many guardrails on it because it's a trusted environment and it has people who are in there who are trusted. So, but I could see if you're having, like, for example, like a, a help assistant, you wouldn't want to put any like proprietary internal information in there, and you'd want to guard that from being accessed externally, like internal, like the internal team roster. You wouldn't want that information to be accessed externally, right?
Right. Yeah. I always think of like you want like stateless kind of agents dealing with public, and you want the stateful ones inside the org, just as a general rule of thumb. But I suppose there's reasons for maybe deviating from that.
Yeah, like the external ones, like you could have stateful in terms of having, remembering the conversation history, but, I don't know how
Right.
much information that you would really want to remember.
And how do you guys define, the reasoning ability? Like what do you, when you think about building these agents and that they can go off and kind of make decisions, how do you think about that? I mean, I know that's kind of an ambiguous question, maybe a difficult question to answer, but
I know that I think of it like, I think of the science fiction. I think of like everybody wants to be a little bit like Tony Stark, maybe with their own Jarvis, or the data from Star Trek on call. And those, at least in those fictions, are very like high reasoning ability robots or positronic brains or whatever. I think I do think of it as like a mirror of human intelligence more and more. And that's a lot to do with like the training models that are running in superclusters on NVIDIA's hardware right now, and those are things that are out of reach for, I think, most organizations, except for like the biggest companies on the planet. And I think it's up to everybody else to be as agnostic as possible and modular as possible to use the right models and the right tooling for the right task. So, yeah, that's how I think of it.
yeah. And Sanjay, any thoughts on this? I know this could be a whole topic in of itself, and we're kind of running up at the top of the hour in a few more minutes. But I mean, I think the governance controls need to be very intentional, where you need to say, okay, what is this agent going to do? What privileges are we giving it? What are we expecting from it? What are we asking of it? Are there other agents that it will have control over? Do we have some kind of a hierarchy? In other words, when you think about FizzBan is an orchestrator. Well, what is he orchestrating? We need to have that kind of control list of the things that FizzBan has access to, right? You're not just going to give it access. Hey, go find an API and do something, right? Some limited number of choices.
Yeah, well, you want to give them a sense of the company org chart, right? Like, just you want them to know who's who and who reports up and who reports down, and the ability for them to spin up their own agent based on the needs of what needs to get done is, I think, a very high level of reasoning ability task, and that's what's like around the corner for us right now.
So I also think there's just one more thing I'd like to say on that, is that like when you give like a decision making task to an agent, either they have enough information to make the decision or they don't have enough information to make the decision, and you have to program what you want its response to do. Do you want it to ask the user for more information if it doesn't have enough information, or do you want it to just make an answer up? And so that's one of the things that you can do with it.
What I found was really interesting, and I do want to have this survey up so what is the stance of leadership in terms of the agent-based approaches? Are people aware of the risks and benefits? Are they not aware, but they don't have the appetite? Are they aware they have an appetite for this? Are they pursuing these approaches or something else? In other words, so go ahead and answer this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think are interesting. So I had used a prompt that came from a company, and I'm blanking on the name now, called For Work or AI for Work. And I mentioned this in another webinar. And I had it do a survey analysis for me. And what was so interesting is that it had a lot of built-in self-assessment and loops to say, do you want me to improve this? And you'd say, sure, go ahead and improve it. And it would evaluate it on multiple criteria. It would use other reference sources. And then it was trying to process my data in my spreadsheet. It was automatically invoking other APIs to do the data correction. So it had some errors and it was trying to fix those errors. And that was trying another way to fix those errors. And that was finally fixing it, but it tried lots of different alternatives. I didn't have to tell it to do that. So I thought that was really fascinating that while I was simply giving it data, it was doing that. So it looks like people are not necessarily aware. Maybe they don't have the appetite. They are aware and have the appetite. That's great. Let me go ahead and just, I think we're done with that poll, so I can stop sharing. And again, what you want to do is start thinking about the processes where there's a lot of human intervention, and map to those data flows, establish the baselines, and thinking about the guardrails for functionality. And what we do is we're offering jointly with Arcana and EIS a discovery session for agent-based approaches. So it's really a sprint. It's very similar to our CAM for AI workshop, stakeholder interviews, education, current state maturity, review of systems, and then an agent proof of value. And these are some of the topics. I'm not going to go into all this, but you can take this and take a look at it. But go ahead and fill in that bottom URL. If you click on that, we can schedule a meeting with you to discuss it and to discuss what some of the possibilities would be. But this can really help you get there. This is really kind of saying, all right, we understand something about generative AI. We understand something about retrieval augmented generation. Let's really look at these agentic approaches. Maybe it's as simple as doing the data remediation for your organization, fixing product data, fixing knowledge for a knowledge base. Those can be simple, straightforward. I don't want to say simple, but they're unambiguous, right? They're things that we can do with today's technology. Or maybe we bring in a collaborative agent like a FizzBan, right? FizzBan is something that can be inserted into your Slack environment. But we want to educate people. We want to help to find the use cases, look at the success factors and so on. So definitely take a look at that and go ahead and fill in that link at the bottom. If you'd like to have a conversation about this, we'd be happy to do that. Additional reading. Here's one of my articles on knowledge management, large language models. I have another one that Sanjay and I co-authored that's coming out in the Journal of Applied Marketing Analytics. That should be coming out soon. And Alexander has a newsletter and his blog in Substack. So you can take a look at that. And here's our contact information. Although I think, Alexander, you said there's a bit of a challenge with your email.
Yeah, it's trapped in iCloud right now.
Contact.
A couple more days, it should be sorted.
What's that?
It'll be sorted in a few days. But yeah, if you want to just reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to talk to anybody.
Yeah, and we're happy to talk as well. So thank you guys for your time today. I'll just leave up that last little URL. Appreciate everything that people have offered and the discussion. And thanks again to Carolyn for all her work behind the scenes. Sanjay, Dominique, and Alexander, thank you for your time. And thank you to the audience. We'll be putting together a series coming up on search approaches and retrieval augmented generation that will also have characteristics around agent approaches. So keep your eyes open for that. Feel free to share this recording and we will talk to you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.